Hi everyone, I'm Gina from Fibers and Design. In this video, we're going to talk about density. Let's get started. What is density? Density is the concentration of something in one space. So how much in one area is there, right? So when you're weaving something with high density, that means there's a lot of yarns. When you're weaving something with low density, it means that there's fewer yarns and it's possibly for a looser pattern. How dense an area becomes is not only influenced by the number of warp yarns in an area, but also the weft yarns. It's important to beat down the weft yarns at a consistent force in order to have a consistent and balanced weft pattern. Now, on the other hand, if in your design calls for some space or looser sections in the weaving, then you have to control it based on what you're going to be weaving. Now, why weave with high density? In order to keep the integrity of a piece with thinner yarns, you need a lot of yarns in one space to help keep it together and secured. The other reason why you would use high density is if you're working on a specific kind of design or pattern. When developing images such as circles or abstract images or natural images, then you're going to use a higher density so that the image is crisper and you can see all the lines and the movement of the piece. When do you use a lower density? Generally, lower density is used when working with thicker yarns, such as roving or a fabric yarn. Now, you would use this because it's a lot easier to maneuver between the yarns. Oftentimes, when you use thicker yarns with a high density, it's very difficult to move the yarns around each of the pieces. Therefore, a lower density makes it a bit more comfortable to weave with these yarns, but also when you're weaving with thicker yarns, you don't really need a lot of warp yarns to secure them. Weaving with a lower density can also show off the texture of the yarn that you're using. When using a higher density, it is possible and visible, the texture. However, when you have more space between the warp yarns, it gives some space and it gives a kind of a loose area for the texture to really show off. Projects with a higher density are normally found on shaft looms or larger tapestry looms. When using a frame looms, I tend to shy away from using a very high density because it's harder to manage all of the yarns. However, when you're using a shaft loom, you're able to control various shafts at the same time and move and maneuver the yarns around. With both high and low density spacing on the warp, you can create interesting designs and patterns as well. Before you start weaving a piece, you want to make sure that you have the proper density for your project. Now, using high density or low density on a project can really influence your work and the result that you get. Now, it depends on what you're trying to create, but in both types of densities, you can create some interesting appearances of the yarn. So I encourage you to experiment and see what it is that you want the warp to do with the weft yarns. Well, now you might be wondering, well, is there really a big difference when I'm using a different density in yarns? And the answer is yes. In the sample that I've created, I've used two different types of warps. The purpose of this sample is to show what can happen when you change the thickness of the warp and the spacing of the warp. Here I have two different types. I have this thinner, the first one is this cotton thin yarn, and then I have this thicker acrylic yarn. Both the thicker and thinner yarn were warped 4 times on the loom in order to test this. 2 sets of warp density was tested with these 2 yarns. There were 4 types of yarns that I used to test this on the sample, and they were this thick yellow yarn, the jersey, this blue-green cotton yarn, and this kind of thin wool yarn. In these samples, I think it shows really clearly how the yarns can be influenced and how they can change their appearance when they're warped differently. Not only with the spacing of the warp yarn, but also in the thickness of the yarn. Let's take a look.
Here the yarns look tight and packed in together, and they stay in place even when I'm passing my finger over them and trying to move them. Here the yarns are packed as well, and they stay in place mostly. There's a little bit of slip with this warp yarn. One of the first things you noticed here is the visual appearance of the weft yarn at this wider spacing. And the second thing with both the thicker warp and the wider it is, you can also see that it doesn't stay very secured. Here you can see the side-by-side comparisons of the two. At a higher density, the weft yarns here appear a lot more packed in together, kind of like small little pebbles or grains of rice. And similar to here, the weft yarn really latches on to that warp and it has its own shape. And here with the looser and the lesser density, you can see that the yarn is a lot more longer, and similar here as well with the thicker warp yarn, that the security of the yarns are not so strong. Here, these side-by-side comparisons give a really good comparison between the different patterns that are created with this thicker and thinner yarn for the warp. I think that in these samples here with the black jersey yarn, you can really see the importance of density in warp spacing. You can see here that it's a totally different shape when you have a different warp and the spacing. Sometimes you can see the pattern of the yarn, and other times it's all squished in like this. So it's such a big difference, and it really shows the importance of testing the warp spacing. You can really create totally different works of art on the loom just based on the density that you're using. So it's something to really think about when you're creating. Here the thicker yarns do really well with this wider spacing, and you can see how fluffy and just how nice this texture is, and you can really show it off a lot. You can bubble up the material, but you can see a really big difference when you're using a higher density. Okay, and it's going through every single warp yarn. You can see that it's more compact, compressed, and you're getting a totally different texture. Now, it's also important to mention here the security of the yarns. The weft yarns stay really in place, especially here at this higher density, and they're not moving around. But on the other hand, you can also build security in the yarns by stacking and adding more yarns together. So here are a few tips on density.
Sample, sample. I recommend that before you start weaving something large, try weaving a small sample of what you're going to be doing. This way you can test out the warp density, the types of yarns you're going to be using. You can also check the color palette. By sampling, you can check all of these things before you start putting so much time and effort into a very large piece or a smaller piece, and then you find out that it doesn't really fit to what you want. The only way that you're going to get better is by practicing. I encourage you to create your own sample and test out what your yarns do. Try using yarns of different thicknesses for the warp, and try also experimenting it like I did with both thin, thick yarns and yarns of different types of material. Okay, I think this will really help you choose the right types of yarn for your project and help you practice and find what best fits. Remember, there's no wrong way of dressing your loom. There's no problem with you trying to experiment and have the yarns have different appearances, but I think it's important that you find out what works best for your projects. And the best way you can do that is with practice and sampling. Once you've picked out the different types of yarns that you want to sample with, then try sampling with different types of spacing, right? Maybe you do some that are 1/4 inch, every 1/2 inch, and if you're feeling really wild, then maybe at every inch. Okay, and so then you can really get a feel for what happens when you're using different yarns at different densities. Alright, well I hope that this video helped you, and if you have any questions, then please leave them in a comment down below, and if this video was helpful for you, then please give a thumbs up, and please subscribe for more videos on weaving. You can also find more tutorials on my website at fibersanddesign.com, and also be sure to check out the playlist. In each of the playlists, I've sectioned out the different types of techniques that you need for different fields, such as weaving colors, weaving shapes, and building composition on the loom. All right, everyone, thank you so very much for watching. See you in the next video. Bye.